edition, back to work. And now we turn our eyes south, Glenn, Latin America, Mexico. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Ryan Berg. He's a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Berg, you are now guest number 2 from AEI, so congratulations on that. When you were at AEI, you were focusing on transnational organized crime, narco trafficking, and illicit networks. You also study Latin American foreign policy and development issues. You are on the show today because earlier this month, you caught Glenn's and my attention by publishing a column for AEI entitled, "Want to Secure North American Supply Chains After the Pandemic? Encourage Mexico's Recovery Package." Dr. Berg, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Glenn, this is a big deal, right?
A huge deal. Yeah, no, I'll just tell you, the work that AEI is doing across the board in this pandemic is just it's exemplary, and it's inspiring to us. And so, thank you, Dr. Berg.
Thank you guys for being consumers of our stuff.
Dr. Berg, let's jump in about your recent article. You pointed out that when it comes to Mexico, the IMF predicts a contraction 6.6% this year. It's the second worst in Latin America, behind imploding Venezuela. All right, well, what's going on? Tell us what's going on and why are things so delicate right now?
Well, I think it's a pretty widely held view that the coronavirus response in Mexico started far too late and has been far too lax. This morning I looked at the Johns Hopkins coronavirus counter, or tracker rather, and saw about 71,000 confirmed cases at present. And so we're talking about a pretty high caseload. We're talking about an economy where about 50% or more of people work in the informal sector. So they really don't have any sort of protections against this type of downturn. Literally, they're outside the bounds of the formal economy, and so they have no access to the social safety nets that you or I would rely on in a very precarious time like this. And as you said, 6.6% contraction. That's the IMF's pretty conservative estimate. As I wrote in the piece, I think that we could see a double-digit contraction in this post-pandemic recession that's going to come and hit everyone. And I think Mexico is particularly poorly poised to weather that storm because its president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is otherwise known as AMLO, has been very reticent or very reluctant to pass any sort of fiscal stimulus, any sort of legislation to shore up Mexican industry. And of course, that could make the recovery even more difficult in Mexico.
Dr. Berg, Glenn's going to talk a little bit about supply chains with you, but contrast this administration's response to coronavirus with the Calderon administration's reaction to H1N1, which, for the most part, the global community seemed to applaud. I guess you're saying that AMLO would not get such high marks.
That's right. He was out campaigning in these sort of big political rallies that he enjoys holding around the country. Well into April, when people were saying that social distancing is the main tool that we have to be able to prevent transmission of the virus. He was shaking hands. He was insisting upon hugging and kissing because it was an essential part of Mexican culture, and he didn't want to see that go away, even though his health minister warned him that these were easy avenues for the spread of the disease. So he did a number of things that were not very fruitful or productive for preventing the transmission of the coronavirus.
Glenn, over to you.
Yeah, one thing that jumps out at me, given all that, is that there was a big issue that seems to be resolving itself in terms of supply chains, and Mexico, when it did act, shutting down what we would consider in many states, including Arizona, not all 50 states, but in many states, essential activities such as manufacturing. And when you think about the supply chains and all this discussion on both sides of the aisle to bring stuff back from Asia and bring it to the United States and to North America, it seems that there may be a synchronization problem. So I just love to get your thoughts, particularly on the manufacturing side, what's been going on with Mexico and with respect to Mexico and how they've treated some of these industries that are vital to the output that we're producing in the United States?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right there. There's been a very haphazard way of going about declaring what is essential and what is not essential, and it really hasn't synchronized with the United States economy at all. And so the National Association of Manufacturing sent this letter to AMLO, basically saying that we're at risk of losing some of these supply chains that we've taken years to be able to deepen and to fortify if we don't open industries sometime soon. And he eventually heeded the advice of the National Association. And so, as you well know, Mexico is starting to open up some of these industries. It's reversed some of its decisions on what constitutes essential. There have been a number of attempts to sort of put in place ways for workers to return to work in a safe manner. Of course, distribution of PPE is essential to that, but it was done in a very haphazard manner. As I mentioned in one of my previous responses, Mexico was far too late to go to social distancing, and then when they did, they ended up closing businesses we would consider to be essential. So kind of swinging in this pendular motion a little bit too far in the other direction. But I'm hopeful now that because Mexico is now beginning to open up again, that those supply chains can remain and can be fortified.
Could you think about how we can now that, the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement will formally take effect July 1? Are there things that we could be doing to better connect the dots when we get into this type of situation, particularly if there's another wave or two? Are there things that we should be doing almost institutionally with Mexico and even with Canada so we keep these supply chains humming safely?
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a trilateral dialogue about synchronization or harmonization, where we come up with joint definition of what is essential, so that even just the very minute things. The people in border states understand this better, I think, than people who aren't living in border states. But supply chains are so complicated that when we're talking about the disruption of a supply chain, we could be talking about something as small as a screw or a nail, or something that is nevertheless a very critical component to something that might go over the border multiple times as it's being assembled. And so therefore there needs to be a conversation. It should be a proactive one right now that we're having in order to make sure that if there is a second wave, which many epidemiologists predict that there will be at the end of this year, we're ready, we're prepared to move forward in harmony after the USMCA is implemented on what constitutes essential and what doesn't.
Garrick, I'll turn it back to you, but I have one other question at this juncture on the tourism side. That's it's a big part of Mexico's economy. For Arizona, it's a big part of our economy to have our friends from Mexico staying in our resorts and going to our shops and eating in our restaurants. What do you see in that area? Is that part of what sort of factors into the pretty dramatic drop of GDP that we're expecting to see in Mexico this calendar year?
Well, unfortunately for Mexico, the pandemic attacks pretty much all of the focal points of their economy. It's not just the tourism industry, which is about 20% of GDP, but it's energy production and manufacturing, as we've discussed. I know many people who have canceled their vacations to Mexico, their spring breaks to Mexico, my parents included, and I don't know when that sort of confidence is likely to come back. That confidence might not come back until there's a workable, viable vaccine for COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus. So I'm not sure when that element of the economy is going to come back, but the energy side of things is also hurting, not only because the president has some sort of bizarre ideas about how to get Pemex, the state-owned oil industry, back up and running, which is the most indebted state-owned oil company in the world. But also, as you guys well know, the world oil markets are completely bottomed out. And so, from an energy production standpoint, even if he wanted to get oil production humming again, there would be no reason to, because the prices haven't taken off again.
Yeah. Dr. Berg, Glenn can tell you all about canceled plans to Mexico. The Arizona Diamondbacks had a series in Mexico City. That's
Right.
off the books. Cardinals were going to be playing there in the regular season when the NFL kicks off, when it kicks off. So a lot of red ink on Glenn's calendar right now.
Yeah, at least 2 trips to Mexico City canceled, because we've been doing, as a state, more and more with Mexico, and on the tourism side, sports tourism side, we, in fact, the Arizona Cardinals were supposed to play in Mexico City. I don't know if it was in December.
Yeah.
At some point this season. That's off the books. But what are the things that I'm curious about as well is on the agricultural side. We've had some issues in the United States with meat processing and things like that. Have there been any things that have caused some issues in terms of just basic nourishment in terms of Mexico?
I think the food supply from Mexico is fairly steady, as far as I know. I haven't read much about supply chains being affected in terms of food production, things that are being exported from Mexico to the United States. We're talking about, of course, about produce, things like tomatoes and avocados. I haven't heard much about a rupture there in those supply chains, but that might be something to look at moving forward.
I wasn't just asking because every day I eat, my breakfast is avocado toast with avocados and tomatoes from Mexico. But
personal interest in making sure that supply chain stays fortified.
There is, yeah.
He's an unabashed shill for fresh tomatoes and avocados from Mexico. Dr. Berg, let's talk about reopening. AMLO's announced a red light, green light, and yellow and orange in there too. I know it's only been a week, but do you have any initial read on how Mexico's private sector is reacting to this tiered approach to reopening? And maybe if you have any sense, even anecdotally, of how the Mexican consumer is reacting to a slow but steady reopening?
Cautiously. There was a press conference where AMLO admitted the fact that Mexico was still going to shed jobs, even though it is starting to reopen. So reopening is not synonymous with job growth or sort of climbing back out of this decline. As we've seen in the United States, reopening can go side by side with continued job losses and unemployment claims, and the same seems to be the case in Mexico. So there was a press conference a day or two ago where AMLO essentially admitted that Mexico was going to continue shedding jobs. I think he said it could be up to 1 million jobs. Shortly thereafter, he said, but it's okay, we're going to produce 2 million of those new jobs back. I don't think many people are holding their breath for 2 million jobs to suddenly fall like manna from heaven down on Mexico. Those are going to have to be clawed back with very careful and conscientious and good policies, which aren't really coming out of his administration right now. As I mentioned in one of my previous answers, the fiscal austerity in Mexico has been something that has been exacerbating the potential economic recovery, because AMLO is unwilling to admit that fiscal stimulus is something that could help the economy. And now he's settled on something that's far too small for what the Mexican economy, given its size, actually needs. I think he's settled on something around $26 billion. So far, according to the IMF, Mexico has spent less than any other country per GDP on its economic recovery. And so it's in a bad spot. And still, the president insists on some of these pet projects that are really near and dear to him. Such as this Pemex refinery down in Tabasco State, the new airport, of course, the Yucatan train, all these sort of glitzy projects that many people think are economically dubious and cost a lot of money, money that could be better spent shoring up Mexican industry.
Well, let's talk about clawing back jobs. Let's say we get on the other side of this pandemic. We've got USMCA in place. You have manufacturers who are perhaps questioning having supply chains in China. Do you think Mexico starts to look like a more attractive place for global investment?
With the right policies, it could. The caveat, of course, is that supply chains are sticky, right? People are resistant to moving them. There's a sort of stickiness or inertia to them. And so it really depends on what we're talking about here. If we're talking about suddenly moving decades of electronics supply chains out of China and into Mexico, that's probably not going to happen at anything close to the speed that maybe some of us would like it to. But it's quite possible that it could. I mean, Mexico is graduating more and more people every year, and so they're poised to enter more high-tech manufacturing, more skilled trades, and they've managed to keep labor costs relatively low. And so one of those competitive advantages that China always had, it's actually seeing rising labor costs. And so by Mexico keeping labor costs relatively steady, China's labor costs increasing, Mexico could indeed become a place that is more attractive for investment, more attractive to locate a supply chain. Something on the con side of the aisle, rising security issues. It's difficult to convince manufacturers and other industries to move to Mexico when every year there's been a steady climb in homicides and security issues. 50% of the people working in the informal sector is also not a very attractive proposal. And so there are a number of issues that sort of need to be worked out, but could over the long run work themselves out, and with conscientious and solid policy on the Mexican side, be a real boon to the Mexican economy. The reason that I wrote the piece that you referenced at the start of this interview is because I think Mexico has a huge opportunity here. I think that there's going to be a bipartisan consensus, or a near bipartisan consensus, to rethink some of these supply chains, to rethink the security of some of these supply chains after the pandemic, particularly extracting some of these supply chains from China. And I think with the right policies, Mexico could be a huge beneficiary of that coming bipartisan consensus.
Absolutely.
Just real quick, the healthcare system, how is that, in your view, held up through this pandemic?
On the Mexican side?
Yes.
As far as I know, it's been tested. It's been put to the limits. It's not. I wouldn't say it's quite at its breaking point to the same extent as a country like Brazil's healthcare system, which is really at capacity and at its breaking point because they have just such a high caseload. The 71,000 confirmed cases as of this morning, that is a high caseload. For a country that had a very fragile healthcare system previously. So something to look for moving forward are any statements by the Mexican deputy or first health minister about the durability of the healthcare system in Mexico.
I also think as someone who comes from a small town called New York City, I think of Mexico City, as North America's largest metropolitan area. Just the thinking in terms of density and public transportation, how that might affect things. I mean, we've been talking about in Arizona, it's definitely an advantage of ours right now that we're more spread out than most other cities. We don't know if that'll just sort of blow over in a year or two, or that's going to be sort of something that people permanently think about. But my gut is that there's going to be a little bit of stickiness around that.
I think this is an issue for Latin America writ large. Latin America is a very urbanized region, and something like 70 or 75% of the region's population lives in densely populated urban areas. And so many of these urban areas are in fact megacities, or on the verge of being megacities. And they have a lot of areas of informal settlement. They have Mexico City, for example, is more than 20 million people, many of whom live on the periphery in pretty marginalized communities where access to healthcare is very difficult, where the types of employment opportunities that are available are really only in the informal sector. And so the pandemic has really presented them with some true dilemmas. Do they stay at home and follow the orders and risk potentially not being able to put food on the table? Or do they go out into the street, into the informal sector, and sell their wares, potentially exposing themselves to contracting the coronavirus? It wasn't in a Mexican context, but it was in the Brazilian context, where the informality issue is roughly the same. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting article about 2 weeks ago where it interviewed a gentleman who sells food on the street. And he basically said, point blank, it's a choice between being able to put food on the table for my family or starving. And the risk that I take is contracting the coronavirus, but I would rather put food on my table than starve at home. And so these are the stark choices that face people in some of these urban dwellings, where even when staying at home, it's very difficult to do social distancing, because in such informality, people live on top of each other. Sometimes you have intergenerational families living in homes. 2-3 generations of people crammed into small spaces. And so if one person contracts the virus, it really does spread quite easily to the rest of the family. And so these are just a small number of problems or challenges that will confront all Latin American governments, but especially the Mexican, given how big Mexico City is as an urban area.
Yeah.
Glenn, how about we do this? I got a list of questions here for the Latin American potpourri for Dr. Berg. I know you've got to run. Do you want to make this a two-parter? You can leave, and then I'll finish up with Dr. Berg for part 2.
Sure. No, that sounds great. And I just really, Dr. Berg, really appreciate you being on the show. The first two-parter we've done, but just a wealth of information. And again, we just appreciate all of your great work and all of AEI's great work.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Berg.
So